Today we're doing another experiment with watercolors, and the first thing I'm gonna do is spray my watercolors to activate them. We need really saturated runny color for this experiment. The pans should be filled with water for this, and then we're gonna put it aside and do the rest of the experiment. You can see the water, like the pans filled with water here, so I'm gonna put it aside and let it do its work, let it marinate so that we can get more saturated colors. And then I'm taking this container, this is just a disposable food container, and I'm filling it with water. We need a straw. Make sure the straw is clean because you need to put one end in your mouth to blow some bubbles. And of course we need watercolor paper. You need thick paper for this experiment. I cut mine in two pieces because I want to do two different experiments, the same experiment but like a variation with different colors. And the paper needs to be thick for this experiment because a lot of water is involved here, and the paper needs to be able to take that water. Now I'm putting some dish soap in that water and we're gonna stir it. I put my papers on the table and then I'm gonna stir the mixture of dish soap and water. Just stirring it makes these little foamy bubbles, but we need bigger bubbles, so I'm gonna start blowing into this concoction of dish soap and water, and these are the bubbles that we're looking for. And I am going to show you my two attempts at this experiment. The first one was a fail, and I'm showing you so that you don't do what I did. So for the first one, I ended up making bubbles, but then to transfer those bubbles onto the paper, I tilted my container, and because of that all the water ran out and onto the papers. The papers got soaking wet. You can see the water running on my table and everywhere. I tried to soak it up with a paper towel, but that didn't help. You can see big puddles of water here on my papers, and this made the bubbles really hard to stick to the papers. And even after I put the paint down on these bubbles, the paint was not transferring onto the paper, so there were no patterns. I made a lot of bubbles and I was really happy that I finally got the hang of how to make the bubbles, but the papers were already so wet that nothing was working, and you can see the bubbles slipping away and they were just not sticking, and the patterns were like nowhere to be found. So this was my first attempt, and then I just gave up. I soaked up all the water and changed my papers. I cleaned my table, and then these are two dry papers on the dry table, and then I decided to put the paint down on one paper first before putting the bubbles on to see if the bubbles will affect the paint that's already on the paper. And I just put a couple of colors that I thought would go together, and it looks so pretty. And then I'm gonna do the same thing. I'm gonna blow into that soap mixture and I'm gonna make a lot of bubbles, and this time this worked way better. This is my attempt number 2, and instead of tilting my container, I took my paper and you can see I swiped the bubbles on it because I didn't want them to be wet like I had them in the first attempt. And then I made some more bubbles and I kept blowing into the mixture. I switched the side of the paper and swiped the bubbles again. And then at last I got the hang of it, and I was finally able to transfer the bubbles directly from the container onto the paper without making it soaking wet. And then I started adding my colors. Now I have to tell you here that these bubbles have a mind of their own and they will burst whenever they like, so you have to kind of work quickly with this. And at one point I was panicking so badly because the bubbles were just going away, so I had to add the paints quickly. And you have to have really runny and saturated paint for this, because if you touch the bubbles with a brush they will burst, and this was happening a lot with me. The smaller bubbles, the smaller foam that you see here right now that I'm working with was much easier to work with as compared to the bigger bubbles. The bigger bubbles were just not having it. So I made some more, and this time I was able to add a big cluster of bubbles directly from the container onto the paper, and I was really happy with this. And I'm gonna start adding my paints again. I chose yellows and oranges and reds for one paper, and for the other one I was gonna go with the pinks and purples that I already had on the paper. And again, you have to work quickly with these. You can see the bubbles just bursting and going away. Also, don't try not to touch your bubbles with the paintbrush. Instead, try to drop the paint. So have a runny puddle on your mixing palette of the paint of the color that you're working with and that you want onto the paper, and then just drop that onto the bubbles, and that will work way better because touching the paintbrush to the bubbles is a gamble and you don't know what will happen. So sometimes the bubbles stay, sometimes they burst, but this is what we have now, and I'm really happy with how they look. And even while they're wet, I think the patterns look so beautiful. And now let's take a look at my palette. My colors got really muddy. The pans got really muddy because I had to work quickly and I was working directly from the pans. So my yellow has a lot of red in it now, and the purple one has pink, the pink one has purple. They're all mixed together. So if you want to save the pans, you can make separate puddles of these colors on your mixing palette. I didn't do that, so my colors got, look at that, look at the bubbles doing their thing in that orange. They have a mind of their own, so they'll do whatever. Now I'm gonna clean a bit around the paper. The papers are really wet and the table is wet too, and I also made beautiful patterns on my table. Look at those patterns. The smaller foam is much more beautiful, I think, as compared to the bigger bubbles, and they make such unexpected patterns. This is what I love about watercolors. And now we have to let them dry completely, but I wanted to try using my heat gun, which I did here, and look at all those holes and look at all the destruction it caused there. Like, you should not use your heat gun here. I don't know what I was expecting, but I wanted to try. So I'm taking my papers now and I'm gonna put them outside in it's not sunny today, it's cloudy, so I'm gonna put them there. It's windy though, so I'm gonna put them outside in the wind and hope for the best. And while I do that, I'm gonna clean my table. Look at my fingers stamped on the table. Everything was covered with soap. It's been 1 hour since I put these papers out. The two blank papers are the ones that were from attempt number 1 that we didn't use, and the papers are still very damp, but the bubbles have gone down and made these extremely beautiful patterns. The patchy colors that you see, the blotches you see on the paper are the paints that I put down before putting the bubbles, before transferring the bubbles. But look at the patterns that the bubbles made. It's so beautiful, and I think these can make really beautiful backgrounds for your subject. Like, for example, if you do blue bubbles, you can do a whale in the foreground and those bubbles will be your background, and they can also make cute postcards or something. I don't know. There are endless ideas and possibilities. But yeah, this is what they look like. They're still very damp, so I'm kind of being careful here, but I love how they turned out, and I hope you try this too. Like, this was so much fun. It was really messy too, but it was also a lot of fun. And there are some things that I learned from this experiment which I would like to share with you. So the first one is to not tilt your container onto your papers to transfer the bubbles, or all the runny soapy water will go onto your papers and make them soaking wet. That's what I did in the attempt number 1. Don't do that. And also, putting the paint down on the paper before transferring the bubbles does not affect the paint in any way. There won't be any patterns on the paint that you already put down, so you have to drop the paint onto the bubbles to make these patterns. And the third one is dropping the paint and not touching the bubbles with your paintbrush. Try to make the puddles of the colors that you want to use on your mixing palette, and then make them runny, and then drop the paint with a dropper or your paintbrush onto the bubbles instead of touching the bubbles. Just avoid touching the bubbles. And making puddles of paint on your mixing palette instead of working directly from the pans will also save your pans from getting muddy like mine did. And I think I covered everything. This was it for today's experiment. I had a lot of fun and I hope you did too, and I'll see you next time.